a quiet sidewalk. A little girl walking home from piano class. But in the eyes of one racist cop, she's not a child, she's a target. He thinks he can break her, silence her, and drive off like nothing ever happened. But what he doesn't know is this girl isn't alone. She comes from strength, and her family isn't the kind you cross and walk away from. What follows is a storm of truth, justice, and consequences that shake the system from the inside out. You're about to hear a story that starts with a scream and ends with a courtroom full of people who finally listen. So tell us, what time are you watching and where are you tuning in from? Drop a comment below, we'd love to know you're here with us. It was the kind of Sunday afternoon Savannah was famous for, hushed, golden, slow as molasses slipping off a spoon. The streets shimmered faintly under the amber light shadows of crepe myrtles dancing across cracked sidewalks, and somewhere far off a church bell chimed the tail end of a hymn that had already faded from memory. Naomi Keller, just 10 years old, but with a posture straight as a piano bench, walked alone with careful steps, her music folder tucked tightly under one arm, like it held something more fragile than sheet notes. In her free hand, she gripped a small, hand-drawn certificate, the corners crumpled from nervous fingers and the walk home, but the words still legible. Outstanding progress, beginner piano, Miss Naomi Keller. She didn't smile. Not because she wasn't proud, she was, but because something in the air felt heavy, like a storm that hadn't decided to show up yet. Her dress, sky blue, with tiny sunflowers embroidered near the hem, rustled lightly with each step, and her white sneakers made soft, scuffing sounds against the concrete. Every so often, she'd glance behind her, not out of fear but habit. A habit that kids like Naomi growing up, black in neighborhoods like hers, were taught early: never trust a quiet street too long. The community center where her piano lessons were held was just 4 blocks from her house, but her mother insisted she always take the same route home. No shortcuts, no alleyways, no detours. Straight lines, Naomi, her mom would say every week, pressing a kiss to her forehead. The world bends enough around us already. Naomi's thoughts drifted as she walked back to the small upright piano in the community rec room, the worn ivory keys slightly sticky from summer humidity, the way Miss Lane's voice always dropped into a soft whisper when Naomi hit the right chords, like she wasn't teaching anymore, just listening. She'd played Beethoven's Ode to Joy today, not perfectly but better than last week, better than before, and that felt like something to hold on to. A lawn sprinkler hissed to life as she passed a yard 2 doors down, and Naomi instinctively stepped to the curb, careful not to get her shoes wet. A dog barked once sharply, then went silent. The wind rustled the oak trees. For a moment she almost forgot the world could turn on her. Almost. A rusted black Ford Crown Victoria rolled slowly around the corner, its tires crunching the loose gravel near the curb. Naomi didn't look up right away. She'd heard that sound before: older model, loud, idle city vehicle. Police. The kind of car that made most adults in her neighborhood straighten up, slow down, look busy. She glanced up casually, her heart doing the smallest skip as the cruiser slowed to match her pace. The tinted passenger window rolled down with a mechanical whine, revealing a man with thinning blonde hair and mirrored sunglasses perched low on his nose. He didn't smile, just tilted his head slightly and said too casually, "You out here by yourself, sweetheart?" Naomi stopped her feet, instinctively pulling back half a step, just like her mother had taught her. "I'm heading home," she answered clearly, trying to sound confident but polite. She pointed. "It's just right there." The man's head didn't turn to look. He stayed watching her, his lip curling just a bit at the edge. "You got ID?" Naomi blinked. "I'm 10, she said softly, unsure if he hadn't heard or if she'd said something wrong. His expression didn't change. The engine hummed like a low growl beside her, the kind of sound that didn't belong on such a quiet street. Naomi felt a ripple of cold trickle down her back despite the Georgia heat. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She just stood there, gripping her certificate a little tighter, breathing a little slower, the way her Aunt Olivia taught her when things felt wrong, but you didn't know what was going to happen next. "Where's your parent?" the officer asked this time, not even pretending to be friendly. Naomi swallowed. "At home," she replied. "Just got out of piano class." She held up the certificate like proof, but the gesture felt childish the second she did it. The officer leaned back slightly in his seat, still watching her, not responding. Then the car door creaked open. His boots landed heavy on the pavement, one thud after another, each louder than the last. Naomi's heartbeat tapped faster. Her legs didn't move. She could feel it, the shift. The silence that came before people yelled. The pause right before something cracked. She'd seen it on television, heard it whispered about at kitchen tables, felt it in the tightening grip of her mother's hand whenever a siren wailed too close to home. But she'd never felt it this near, this sharp, this real. And in that moment, standing under the soft swaying branches with her dress, brushing her knees, and her certificate trembling in her hand, Naomi realized something she would never forget. Sometimes danger doesn't come with noise or warning, or even reason. It just steps out of a car, looks you in the eye, and waits for you to flinch. She didn't know yet what would happen next. Only that her heart was racing, her mouth dry, and her thumb inching toward the emergency shortcut on her phone, the one her aunt made her memorize just in case. The air smelled like hot pavement and cut grass, but all Naomi could feel was the weight of eyes that didn't see her as a child, a student, or even a person, just a question mark in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the street, once quiet, now felt like it was holding its breath. The cruiser door swung open with a dull, metallic groan that seemed to cut straight through the late afternoon warmth, and as the officer stepped out, his boots struck the pavement with a heavy finality, like each thud had its own judgment behind it. Naomi didn't move, though every instinct told her to take a step back. Just one, just enough to breathe easier, but her feet held her ground out of something between stubbornness and shock. The man approached slowly, not running, not yelling, but with a coiled energy that made her chest tighten, like something dangerous was hiding in plain sight, waiting for permission to erupt. His sunglasses caught the sunlight as he came closer, reflecting not her face, but the street behind her, as if she didn't exist in his frame of focus at all. "Where exactly do you live?" he asked flatly, not curious, not concerned, just issuing another line in a checklist he had already decided the answers to. Naomi raised her hand slowly and pointed again down the block. "That house," she said, her voice soft but clear, her eyes searching his for a flicker of recognition or understanding. She wanted him to believe her, not because she owed it to him, but because she sensed that disbelief in this moment was a threat. But instead of acknowledging her, he tilted his head slightly, as if weighing an invisible scale, and then asked again, "Got any ID on you?" The question hit different this time, not as an inquiry, but as a challenge, a way to corner her. "I'm 10, she repeated more quietly now, the words feeling smaller the second they left her mouth. He stood in front of her now, arms folded across a stiff uniform shirt that strained at the seams near the shoulders, his face unreadable beneath the mirrored lenses, though the set of his jaw spoke plenty. "You talk like you know things," he said, voice tinged with something bitter. "Where'd you say you were coming from?" Naomi swallowed, her fingers twitching against the smooth plastic of her music folder. "The community center," she answered. "I had piano class." Her breath caught slightly, as if even speaking that truth felt like crossing a line. His gaze dropped to the certificate still in her hand, but he didn't acknowledge it. His attention wasn't on who she was. It was on who he assumed she wasn't. Without warning, he stepped closer, too close, the space between them shrinking to nothing. Naomi's shoulders tensed, but she held her chin level, just like her Aunt Olivia taught her. "Never let fear sit alone on your face." "You think I don't know what's going on around here?" he muttered. "Kids walking around like they own the block, lying straight to my face." Naomi blinked, confused. "I didn't lie," she whispered, but the words barely made it out. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped, and then his hand shot forward, wrapping around her wrist before she could pull back. The grip wasn't firm, it was violent, sharp, like a trap snapping shut on instinct, not thought. Naomi gasped, not just from the pain, but from the sheer disbelief that it was actually happening, that someone with a badge and a gun would grab a child like that in broad daylight. "Let go, please," she said, her voice shaking, now the panic finally rising in her throat as her certificate slipped from her hand and fluttered down to the sidewalk. "Let go," she repeated louder this time, but his hand only tightened. His other hand clamped down on her shoulder, turning her roughly so her back was toward the street, and Naomi felt her heart kick against her ribs like it wanted out. "You want to keep talking," he hissed into her ear. "Keep lying." Her body tried to twist away, but her arm wouldn't move the way she needed it to. There was pressure, then pain, and then something beyond pain, something hot and wrong and final. A crack split the air, loud and raw like a snapped tree limb, and Naomi screamed, the sound rising out of her before she could even register it. She crumpled her knees, giving out beneath her, her whole world collapsing down into a small circle of noise, pain, and disbelief. She hit the ground hard, the concrete scraping her palms as she instinctively tried to catch herself, but her right arm just hung useless, bent at an angle it should never have known. The officer stood over her, breathing heavy like he'd just won something. "That's what happens," he muttered, "when you think you can play smart." Naomi sobbed, the sound breaking in her throat, not because she was crying like a child, but because her body didn't know what else to do. Her face pressed against the sidewalk, hot with tears, dirt clinging to her cheek. "I didn't do anything," she whispered to no one, maybe to herself. "I didn't do anything." A car passed in the distance. A dog barked again briefly. Somewhere, a lawnmower started up, as if the world hadn't just cracked open on a child in the middle of a sunlit street. Naomi's phone had fallen screen down near the gutter, but her thumb, quick and practiced, had already done what Aunt Olivia taught her, pressed and held the side button 3 times. Emergency call activated. A quiet vibration buzzed beneath the screen. A single name blinked across the top: Aunt Liv, emergency only. She lay there, her breath short and shallow, her eyes blinking through tears as the sky blurred above her, pale blue and uncaring. The officer reached for something on his belt, maybe cuffs, maybe something worse, but Naomi wasn't watching anymore. Her body was too busy hurting, and her mind was already retreating, pulling inward like a scared animal trying to survive. Across town, a phone rang. Not loud, just once, then again. And then someone answered. A voice said nothing at first, just listened, and then moved. And there on the sidewalk, in the full glare of a Georgia sun that had seen too much and said too little, Naomi Keller lay still, her cast-aside certificate curling at the corners near her feet, like it too had given up the fight. The pain didn't come all at once. It arrived in pulses, rising from Naomi's arm in slow, searing waves that made it hard to breathe, let alone cry out again. She lay curled on the pavement, eyes wide open, not blinking, because even that slight motion seemed like it might shake her body into more agony. Her fingers twitched instinctively, but only on one hand. The other was limp, twisted, cradled awkwardly against her ribs, as if it no longer belonged to her. Her mind couldn't quite catch up to what had just happened, couldn't process how something so violent could erupt from a conversation that didn't even deserve to be called a confrontation. There were no sirens, no witnesses, rushing over, just the static hum of summer air and the low grumble of the police cruiser idling beside her like nothing had gone wrong. Officer Tolman stood above her, and in that moment he didn't look like someone shocked by what he'd done. Instead, he looked annoyed, like Naomi's presence on the ground had disrupted his afternoon. His hands rested on his belt fingers, brushing near the handcuffs, the way some men reach for a reflex they've practiced too often. "That's what happens when you don't listen," he muttered under his breath. Not even to her, maybe just to himself, as if the broken body of a 10-year-old child was merely a consequence of disobedience, not a tragedy. Naomi heard the words, but couldn't form a reply. Her mouth was dry, her lips slightly parted, a soft gasp escaping every few seconds with each throb of white, hot pain. Down the street, wind rattled the dry leaves in the gutter, and the sound felt louder than it should have, like nature itself was holding its breath. A bicycle bell rang faintly from a block over. Naomi wanted to call for help, wanted to scream, but all she could do was hold on. Hold on to the single lifeline she had activated, that emergency shortcut. She'd practiced on her phone a dozen times, even when it felt silly, even when her mom said, "It's probably not something you'll ever use, but better safe than sorry." That shortcut had sent out one signal, one call to one person who never ignored her. Aunt Olivia was slicing vegetables in her small kitchen when the call came through the phone, vibrating once then again before it automatically picked up on speaker. At first there was only background noise, a car engine, footsteps, the faint rustle of clothing. Then came Naomi's voice, thin and scared, followed by a man's sharp and accusing. Olivia didn't move at first. She just stared at the phone, her hand tightening around the knife, knuckles whitening. Then came the crack, loud and unmistakable, like something sacred being snapped in half. Naomi's scream followed, raw and short, and then nothing but her breathing and the officer's angry mutterings. Olivia didn't speak. She didn't curse. She didn't cry. She just wiped her hands, reached for her car keys, and walked out the door like someone who had waited her whole life for a reason to act. Her boots hit the porch steps with purpose, each step echoing with memory of drills, deployments, and promises she had made when Naomi was barely old enough to walk. She had told her once in the quiet after a storm, "If something ever goes wrong, press and hold. I'll come." The drive was a blur of trees, brake lights, and clenched teeth. Olivia's mind raced through every possible scenario, but the truth was already carved into her chest. She'd heard it, she'd felt it, And the one thing she couldn't shake was the knowledge that Naomi had been polite, had been clear, had followed every rule her family had ever drilled into her, yet still ended up on the ground, her arm broken by a man who didn't see her as a child, only as something to control. Back on the street, Naomi's breath was growing shallow, and her body began to shake, not from fear, not anymore, but from shock. Her eyes fluttered shut for a second before jerking open again, her instinct telling her to stay awake, stay conscious, stay here. She could feel her phone buzzing faintly near her hip, still connected, still open. Her fingers reached for it, but the pain made her freeze again. She didn't know how much time had passed, seconds, minutes, hours. It all felt the same when pain was the only thing keeping time. And then, just when she thought he might put the cuffs on her, that he might drag her to the car like she was a suspect and not a victim, Officer Tolman suddenly looked up. A voice had called out, maybe from a nearby porch, maybe a neighbor had finally stepped outside, maybe something had shifted in the world's silence. Naomi couldn't see, but she heard his breath change just slightly. He didn't say a word. He didn't check her pulse. He didn't even look her in the eye. He just stepped back, climbed into his cruiser, and pulled away like he had somewhere more important to be. The sound of the tires rolling off felt like a door slamming shut in her chest. She was alone again, the weight of her broken arm pressing down on her like gravity had turned spiteful. Naomi let out a sob, not because she was afraid, but because the absence of help, of kindness, of anything remotely human, hurt more than the injury itself. And still, somewhere in the back of her mind, the connection remained. Olivia was listening. She had to be. 3 blocks away, a passing EMT vehicle slowed at the intersection, catching a glimpse of a girl lying by herself on the pavement. The driver tapped the siren once, a short blip, and the vehicle rolled forward. Naomi heard it barely, but it was enough. Enough to know someone might still stop. Someone might still see her. And as the sun slipped lower behind the rooftops, casting long shadows over Naomi's small body and the crumpled certificate beside her, the only thing she could cling to was that someone somewhere was already on the way. Olivia didn't speed, though every nerve in her body told her to floor it. Instead, she gripped the steering wheel with hands so steady they almost betrayed the wildfire building behind her eyes. The truck hummed along the old county road like a blade sheathed in patience, her eyes locked on the horizon as if distance itself was an enemy to be conquered, not crossed. She didn't blink much, didn't speak aloud, didn't let the radio fill the silence. Only the voice in her head, sharp and familiar, reciting facts like a soldier reviewing a mission. Naomi was hurt. An officer had laid hands on her, and she had heard it happen in real time, heard the panic, the pleading, the snap. The echo of that bone cracking still rang in her ears, not just as a sound, but as a violation, an unholy punctuation that turned every mile between her and that sidewalk into something sacred she had to reclaim. She didn't let herself imagine what Naomi looked like right now, didn't allow pictures of bruises or broken limbs to bloom behind her eyes, because if she did, she might break her own rules, and today wasn't a day for breaking anything but silence. She breathed through her nose deep and controlled, and reached across to the passenger seat where her phone sat, screen still open to the active emergency call. Naomi's line hadn't gone dead. 37 minutes and counting. That meant the girl was trying to hold on. That meant Olivia had to do the same. Stephen picked up on the first ring, his voice low and alert, no hint of disbelief or delay. "Talk to me," he said. How bad Olivia's throat tightened, but her voice came out calm and deliberate. "He broke her arm," she said. "She called me. I heard everything." There was silence on the line, the kind that stretched too far, like a calm ocean right before the undertow rips through. "Where is he now?" Stephen asked finally. "Gone," Olivia replied. "Drove off. Just left her there." There was a pause, and then Stephen's voice returned colder than winter steel. "You find him. You hold him. I'll come through the walls myself if I have to." Olivia didn't nod, didn't promise, didn't offer comfort. She just said, "I got her." And then she hung up because that was enough. Words didn't fix broken bones, and they wouldn't stop what had already been set in motion. What mattered now was movement. What mattered now was precision. What mattered was getting to that hospital before anyone tried to rewrite the story. The roads narrowed as she hit city limits, the trees giving way to telephone poles and corner stores, and her breath slowed with each turn. The world hadn't changed, not yet. The sun still spilled like honey across rooftops. Children still pedaled rusting bikes on cracked sidewalks. People still stood in line at taco trucks and gas stations like everything was fine. But Olivia knew better. She always had. Uniforms didn't make people safe. Truth didn't always rise on its own. And justice, real justice, was a muscle most people forgot they had until something tore it. The hospital came into view just as her phone finally buzzed again, a nurse's voice cutting in over speaker. "Are you the emergency contact for Naomi Keller?" Olivia responded without slowing. "Yes, I'm 5 minutes out." "What room?" There was rustling then, a pause. "She's stable," the nurse said, "but she's not talking much. Right arm fractured, severe displacement. She's in room 6. Olivia didn't say thank you. She just pulled into the nearest open space, left the keys in the ignition, and moved like a current cutting through still water. Inside the hospital smelled like antiseptic and fluorescent light, clean but tired. She bypassed the front desk with a glance that silenced questions before they formed, her voice firm but not loud. "Emergency contact for Naomi Keller. I need room 6. The nurse behind the counter blinked, then pointed. Olivia walked the hallway like she'd walked thousands before, measured exact but never aimless. Each footstep carried the weight of something more than speed. It carried promise. It carried fury. It carried love. The door was already ajar. She didn't knock. She didn't have to. Naomi lay small and pale on the bed, a brace wrapped around her swollen arm, her face turned toward the window like she was trying to pretend none of it had happened. But when she heard Olivia's boots cross the tile, she turned, and her face crumpled, not in pain but in relief, so fierce it broke whatever composure she had left. "Aunt Liv," she whispered the words, catching like thorns in her throat. Olivia crossed the room in 2 strides, dropping to her knees beside the bed, her hands gentle against Naomi's uninjured arm. "I'm here," she murmured, brushing a loose curl from the girl's forehead. "You did everything right, baby. I've got you now." Naomi buried her face into Olivia's shoulder, shaking from more than pain, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Olivia just held her, her cheek resting against Naomi's crown, her eyes fixed on nothing and everything at once. And when Naomi finally pulled back and looked up, her voice was barely audible. "I told him who my dad was," she said. "I told him, and he laughed." Olivia didn't blink. She didn't gasp. She just stilled completely, like something ancient and dangerous had gone still inside her. She stood up slowly, her hand brushing Naomi's hair one last time, before she turned toward the window, eyes narrowing. "This wasn't a mistake," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "He knew. And he didn't care." She pulled her phone from her back pocket, scrolled to the emergency call log, and pressed play. Naomi's voice filled the room again, soft, scared, pleading, interrupted by the officer's threats, the snap, the scream. The nurses in the hallway froze, caught in the sound of something no one should ever hear from a child. Olivia turned toward them, calm but unflinching. "Do you know who that officer was?" she asked. One nurse shook her head. Another whispered, "Not yet." "I'm about to find out," Olivia said quietly. And as she walked out of room 6, she didn't look back. Because in her heart, something had already changed, not just in her, but in the course of what came next. And behind her, in the still silence of a hospital room that had already seen too much, Naomi finally closed her eyes, not in fear, but in the safety of knowing someone was fighting her battle now. Officer Rick Tolman didn't look in the rearview mirror as he pulled away from the curb. He didn't glance back at the girl, curled on the sidewalk, didn't bother to check if anyone had seen, didn't care if anyone had heard. His hand gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his knuckles pale under the strain, but his face remained disturbingly calm, as if nothing that had happened deserved space in his conscience. The cruiser moved steadily through the neighborhood, past neat rows of bungalows and blooming rose bushes, the tires hissing softly against the road like the world was trying to hush the violence that had just occurred. Inside the car, the only sound was the click of his jaw, tense and silent, and the rhythmic thud of his thumb tapping against the steering wheel, a beatless metronome counting down something unsaid. He didn't have a plan, not really, not beyond getting out of sight for a while, disappearing just long enough to let things blow over. There was no report filed, no call made, no backup requested. As far as dispatch was concerned, 73D was out on routine patrol, nothing unusual, logged just another Sunday. But deep down, Tolman knew something had shifted, something irreversible. The girl's scream was still lodged in his ear, not as guilt, he didn't believe in that, but as a reminder that sometimes trouble doesn't wait to be noticed. Sometimes it runs faster than your excuses. Back on the corner where he'd left her, the street had fallen into an unnatural stillness, like the moment after a storm where everything holds its breath. Naomi lay half-curled on her side, her good hand trembling, as she tried to shield her fractured arm, her body too shocked to sob again, too wrung out to scream. The pavement beneath her was still warm, but it might as well have been ice for how cold she felt inside, as if the moment he drove away had taken some vital heat from the air itself. She didn't try to sit up. She didn't even try to reach for her phone. All she could do was lie still and wait for someone to notice, wait for help, wait for something to feel real again. The first sound she registered wasn't sirens or footsteps, it was the faint squeak of bicycle tires on concrete, then the sharp click of brakes. A boy, maybe 12, maybe 13, stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, his sneakers dragging as he came closer, his backpack still slung over one shoulder. He looked at her for a moment, not saying anything, just watching with eyes that were too wide, too knowing for his age. Then he dropped his bike without a word and ran up the street, disappearing around the corner. Naomi didn't move, but in her chest something flickered, a quiet, fragile hope. He came back 3 minutes later, breathless, dragging a woman behind him who wore a house dress and mismatched slippers, her face pale with alarm and disbelief. "Oh my God," she muttered as she knelt beside Naomi, her hands fluttering, unsure where to touch. "Sweetheart, can you hear me? Can you talk?" Naomi blinked and the woman saw it, saw the pain, the confusion, the need for something soft in a world that had just turned sharp. "Help's on the way, okay," she said, her voice steadying. "We're gonna get you help." Across town, Olivia sat in the hospital waiting room, her elbows on her knees, her phone face down on the bench beside her, the screen still open to the active call. She hadn't hung up, couldn't. Some part of her still needed to believe that staying connected, even one-sided, was an anchor for Naomi, a signal that she was never really alone, not in pain, not in fear, not in anything. The hospital air was cold and smelled like bleach and disappointment, and every second that passed without a new update pressed harder on Olivia's chest, like something invisible trying to break her from the inside. When the doors finally swung open and Naomi was wheeled in, Olivia stood before the nurse even spoke. The child was barely conscious, her small body dwarfed by the stretcher, her arm wrapped in gauze, and stabilized her curls, matted with sweat, her shoes missing. Olivia didn't cry, didn't yell, didn't reach for anyone. She simply walked beside the gurney, her hand brushing Naomi's shoulder with the gentlest pressure, the kind that said, "You're not alone now. You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Once Naomi was stable, sedated, and resting, Olivia stepped outside the room and leaned against the cool tile wall, her breath finally hitching not with weakness, but with a clarity so sharp it could have drawn blood. There was no longer any doubt, no gray area, no confusion. What happened on that street was not a misunderstanding. It wasn't overreaction. It was brutality, plain and deliberate. And the man responsible had walked away like it cost him nothing. She opened her phone, found the photo of the call log, the audio recording still intact, and forwarded it to one contact only, Sergeant Maria Sodto, Internal Affairs. "I need a trace on Patrol Unit 73D, she typed. "Girl assaulted. Officer fled the scene. I have audio." No explanation, no small talk, just the truth. And a few seconds later, Maria responded, "Send everything. I'll get you a name." Olivia exhaled slowly and closed her eyes, her fingers tightening around the phone. Outside the window, the sky was turning the color of rust, the sun slipping behind buildings that didn't care who broke or who healed. But in that fading light, one thing remained clear: this wasn't over, not by a long shot. And across the room, Naomi turned slightly in her sleep, her broken arm still wrapped in care, her breath finally deepening. For the first time since the sidewalk, she didn't look afraid. She just looked like a child who had been found. The hospital room was quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes after pain has taken everything loud and left only the ache. Naomi lay motionless on the bed, her arm cradled in a temporary brace, wrapped in clean white gauze that couldn't cover the purple swelling underneath. Her face was pale, her lips dry, but her eyes, though heavy with exhaustion, remained open, not fully awake, not fully asleep, hovering in that gray space where the body tries to make peace with what the mind still doesn't understand. She didn't cry anymore, not because the pain was gone, but because she had already crossed some invisible threshold beyond tears. The nurse had dimmed the lights after the last check-in, and now the room held the soft glow of early evening, filtered through cheap vertical blinds that sliced the sunlight into long shadows crawling up the wall. Outside the room, Olivia stood with her back against the wall, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, not defensive, but containing something fierce that hadn't found a place to go yet. Her phone was still warm in her hand from the call she'd just made, her thumb hovering near the screen as if it might ring again with news or questions or consequences. The audio file had already been sent, the photo of Naomi's injuries already forwarded, the time and location logged. She had shared it with only one person, someone who knew how to move without asking permission. And yet, even with those steps taken, she couldn't shake the heaviness in her chest, the knowledge that this wasn't just about a girl and a broken arm, it was about what people choose to see and what they allow themselves to ignore. Inside the room, Naomi stirred slightly, and Olivia stepped back in her boots, muffled by the sterile floor tiles, her presence steady and quiet. She sat beside the bed, her chair pulled close, and rested her hand lightly on the edge of the mattress. Naomi blinked slowly and turned her head, eyes meeting Olivia's with the faintest flicker of recognition. "You stayed," she said, her voice rasping like dry leaves. Olivia nodded once. "Of course I did." Naomi's lips parted as if to say something more, but the effort proved too much, so she simply looked away, her gaze drifting toward the wall where her certificate had been taped slightly, crooked, a few edges curling where the tape didn't hold. Olivia followed her gaze and exhaled slowly, the sound almost a sigh but carrying the weight of something more. "You did everything right," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "You remembered the shortcut. You stayed calm. You called me." Naomi's fingers shifted slightly, curling toward her palm, and then she whispered, almost inaudible, "He didn't believe me." The words hung in the air for a moment, too heavy to disappear quickly, and Olivia leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "No, baby, he didn't," she said. "But that's not your fault. That was never about you. That was about him, about his fear, his power, his choice." She paused, watching the way Naomi's eyes flinched at the word choice. Like even now, the idea that someone had chosen to hurt her was harder to accept than the hurt itself. Olivia continued, softer now. "Some people wear a uniform to protect, some wear it to hide." There was no answer. Just the slow beep of the heart monitor and the occasional soft hum of the air conditioning unit kicking on and off, the rhythm of a space trying to feel normal again. Olivia leaned back and stared at the ceiling, her jaw clenched tight as the audio from the call replayed itself in her mind for the 100th time. She could still hear Naomi's voice saying, "I didn't do anything," and then the officer's voice cutting through, sharp, dismissive, followed by that horrible crack. That sound didn't just break a bone, it broke something deeper, something in the trust that kids are taught to give too early and too often. A nurse walked in quietly to check Naomi's vitals, her expression careful but kind, the kind of practiced neutrality Olivia had seen 1,000 times before. But as she adjusted the IV drip, she glanced at the cast, at Naomi's face, then at Olivia, and something changed in her expression, a flicker of recognition, maybe even solidarity. She didn't say much, just placed a hand gently on Naomi's blanket and whispered, "You're safe now, sweetheart." Naomi didn't reply, but her shoulders relaxed by a fraction, and for the first time since she'd been wheeled in, she closed her eyes fully, not just from pain, but from exhaustion that finally had permission to rest. When the nurse left, Olivia reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small audio recorder she'd used to preserve the call just in case the phone log failed or was scrubbed. She stared at it for a moment before placing it on the bedside table next to the water cup and a folded napkin with Stephen's name scribbled on it in thick black pen. "Your dad's on his way," she said quietly. "He'll be here soon." Naomi didn't respond, but Olivia didn't expect her to. Some things didn't need words, they just needed presence, steadiness, the kind that holds the world together while it's trying to fall apart. She stood slowly, walked to the window, and pulled the blinds open just enough to let the light touch the floor, warm and gold like the end of summer. Outside, traffic moved as usual. People walked dogs. A mother pushed a stroller past the ER entrance. The world was still turning, still unaware that inside this room something had been shattered that couldn't be fixed with time or tape or quiet apologies. Olivia closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it settle into her bones, not running from it, not shrinking under it, because the truth was simple. What happened today was not an accident. It was a decision made in broad daylight by a man in power against a child with none. And the only way to answer that kind of violence was with truth that didn't flinch, with action that didn't wait, and with voices that refused to be quiet anymore. She opened her eyes again, looked at Naomi sleeping, and made a silent promise not to move on but to move forward. By the time the sun dipped behind the rooftops and cast the sky in a soft burnt orange, the clip had already begun to spread quietly at first, among trusted contacts and encrypted circles, then more freely passed from inbox to inbox like a secret too heavy to keep. It wasn't edited. It wasn't enhanced. It didn't need music or commentary or warning labels. The truth, when unfiltered, speaks in its own voice, and Naomi's voice did just that. Small, scared, heartbreakingly polite at first, then shattered by pain, echoing across frequencies with a rawness that no screen could soften. The crack of her arm snapping wasn't just a sound anymore. It had become a symbol, one that pierced even the most distracted scroll. Olivia hadn't planned for it to go public so soon. At first, she just wanted the right people to hear it. Internal affairs attorneys, a few trusted reporters who'd spent their careers chasing the stories no one else dared touch. But when one of those reporters called back, voice tight with emotion, and said, "This needs to be heard now, not tomorrow, not after legal vetting now," Olivia didn't argue. She just took a breath, clicked upload, and sent the truth into the world with no caption, no plea, just the raw audio and a quiet title. She said she was 10. Within 3 hours, the video had been shared over 50,000 times. Within 6 national civil rights groups had reposted it. By morning, it was being looped on major news channels, some of them playing it with heavy disclaimers, others letting the unedited clip speak for itself. Commentators argued over it, dissected the legality, the protocol, the officer's voice, but what couldn't be argued, what stopped people cold, was Naomi's plea. "I didn't do anything," she said, and no one could unhear that once they did. Olivia watched it unfold from the hospital hallway, leaning against the same wall she'd stood by the night before, arms folded across her chest, face unreadable. Nurses passed her with quiet nods. A janitor paused by the vending machine to ask gently, "That's your niece?" And when she nodded, he just said, "She's strong," then walked away without waiting for a reply. Not everyone had words, but everyone had heard. Even those who didn't say so looked different now, less rushed, more aware, as if something had cracked open and they were trying to decide whether to look away or lean in. Her phone buzzed every few minutes. Texts from journalists, emails from advocacy groups, calls from numbers she didn't recognize. But the one that mattered came just after dawn. Sergeant Maria Soto's voice was clipped, but clear, a practiced calm with something urgent under the surface. "We traced it," she said. "Unit 73D. Officer Rick Tolman, Wilmington Division. Badge 5372. Not even on the schedule yesterday. He took the car without authorization." Olivia closed her eyes, took a breath, then asked, "Where is he now?" Maria hesitated. "Every Sunday, like clockwork. Benny's Grill off Highway 22. Same time, same booth. But Olivia, don't do anything reckless." There was a pause before Olivia replied, not because she hadn't already made up her mind, but because she was measuring the weight of what came next. "I'm not going to touch him," she said, her voice steady. "Not yet." By 9:00 a.m., Benny's Grill was just starting to fill up. The smell of burnt coffee and overcooked bacon floated through the air, clinging to the vinyl booths and tired waitresses like tradition. Rick Tolman sat near the window, laughing at something on his phone, a half-eaten omelet pushed aside. He looked relaxed, untouched by the chaos outside those smudged glass panes, as if his world hadn't changed at all. Olivia parked across the street, took a moment to steady her breath, then crossed with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who wasn't there to rush anything, only to be seen. The bell above the door jingled softly as she stepped inside. Heads turned briefly, then went back to their meals, except Tolman, whose smirk faltered the second he saw her face. Olivia didn't sit. She didn't raise her voice. She just pulled out her phone, tapped once, and let the audio play. Naomi's voice filled the diner, clear, trembling, unforgettable. "Please stop. That hurts. I didn't do anything." Then came the snap. The room went silent. Utensils paused mid-air. Conversations died mid-sentence. Tolman's smirk collapsed completely, and he leaned forward, his voice suddenly thin. "Where'd you get that?" Olivia stared at him. "You know who that little girl is?" she asked, her tone like cooled steel. Tolman shook his head too fast. She resisted. Olivia stepped closer. "She's Steven Seagal's daughter," she said calmly. "And I'm Olivia Keller." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. She didn't need him to speak. She slid a napkin across the table, 4 lines written in ink that had already begun to bleed slightly from her palm. "Room 6, Savannah Regional. 10 years old, broken arm, audio, witnesses, internal affairs. Then she leaned in slightly and added just loud enough for the whole booth behind him to hear, "By the time my brother lands, you'll be lucky to keep your badge." Tolman started to speak again, something defensive forming, but Olivia didn't give him the space. "You people think you can hurt children and walk away clean," she said. "But you picked the wrong family, and the wrong girl." She didn't yell. She didn't flinch. She turned and walked out the room, still frozen behind her. Back outside, she didn't look back. Her phone buzzed again. Sato, one of the waitresses, called it in. Said you were calm, said you played something that made him pale. Olivia didn't smile. "I just dropped the truth on the table," she said. And as she slid behind the wheel of her car, her fingers finally relaxed on the steering wheel, her breath, even her mind, sharp. Naomi's voice was still playing softly in her head, not as pain now, but as purpose. And in that moment, Olivia knew the reckoning had begun, not in a courtroom, not with a press release, but right there in a diner where silence met consequence. By the time Olivia returned to the hospital that afternoon, the atmosphere had changed, not just inside Naomi's room, but out in the corridors, at the front desk, in the waiting room, where strangers suddenly locked eyes, a second longer than necessary, as if trying to read who among them already knew. The story had escaped the walls. It had taken shape and breath, spreading through phones and whispers, through headlines and hashtags that bent around Naomi's name like armor. Olivia could feel it the moment she stepped back into the building, an invisible charge in the air, a tension humming low beneath the fluorescent lights, the kind of quiet that follows realization, not relief. Naomi was resting when she entered her small frame, barely moving under the soft hospital blanket, her breathing even but shallow, as if her body was still bracing for something. The certificate from her piano class had been moved to the nightstand, placed neatly beside a new edition, a hand-drawn card with uneven letters that read, "You're brave. You matter. We see you." Olivia stared at it for a long moment, her fingers grazing its edge, like it might vanish if she blinked too fast. It wasn't signed, and that somehow made it feel more powerful, as if the words came from the world, not just one person. She sat beside the bed again, not speaking, not needing to. The silence was gentle now, not empty. Naomi's eyelids fluttered slightly, but she didn't wake. Her hand twitched under the blanket, and Olivia reached out, rested her own hand nearby, not touching, just close enough to remind her she wasn't alone. In the hallway, a nurse passed slowly, eyes soft, with something between sympathy and anger. Olivia didn't miss it. She was starting to recognize the look now. People who had seen the video heard Naomi's voice and felt something shift inside them that wouldn't shift back. The audio had done what Olivia couldn't do in 100 speeches. It made people listen. Not argue, not explain, just listen. That alone felt like a kind of miracle. Her phone buzzed gently in her coat pocket. She answered without checking. "It's done," came the voice on the other end. His name, badge, assignment, disciplinary history, everything. "It's in your inbox." Olivia nodded once. "Thank you," she said, then hung up. There was nothing more to say. The wheels were already turning. She had no intention of stopping them, but as she sat there, listening to the quiet hum of machines and the steady beat of a child's heart recovering from betrayal, Olivia felt something else. Stir grief, not for the damage done, but for how familiar it had all become. This wasn't the first child, and they both knew it wouldn't be the last. The badge had changed, the face had changed, but the fear, that was always the same. Naomi had done everything right, had stayed calm, had spoken clearly, had used the tools she was given, and still, it hadn't saved her. That truth settled heavily in Olivia's chest like smoke that never lifted. She rose and stepped into the hallway, needing air that didn't carry the scent of antiseptic and institutional sorrow. Outside the window, the parking lot shimmered under the afternoon sun, people coming and going, lives continuing. The world, she thought, doesn't pause just because a child breaks. It barely even stutters. Her phone buzzed again, this time a news alert. She glanced down and saw her own face frozen mid-step, exiting Benny's grill, followed by bold letters. "Confrontation, caught on audio. Aunt of injured child faces officer who fled." Below that, social media was ablaze. Clips from the diner, reposts of the call, reactions, commentary, outrage. But also something more, a kind of reckoning. People weren't just watching, they were responding. And for a brief moment, Olivia allowed herself to feel it, not victory, but movement. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't swung, she hadn't needed to. Truth, when spoken plainly, has its own gravity. Inside the room, Naomi stirred again, her brow creasing slightly. Olivia returned quickly, sat back in the chair and leaned forward. Naomi's eyes opened slowly, meeting hers, searching her face for something unspoken. Olivia gave a small nod. "He knows now," she said. Naomi didn't ask who. She didn't need to. There was silence again, but this time it felt different, full, not empty. And in that stillness, Olivia saw it, the quiet strength of a girl who had endured something brutal and walked out of it with her voice intact, even if her body had not yet healed. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't vengeance. It was presence, the unshakable presence of someone who refused to disappear. Outside the window, a breeze stirred the trees. A bird landed briefly on the ledge, then took flight. Olivia followed its path with her eyes, then turned back to Naomi, her voice low even. "Whatever comes next," she said, "we face it on our feet. No more silent." And Naomi, barely above a whisper, said, "Okay," that one word soft, as it was felt like a stake in the ground. Not a promise, not a cry for help, just a declaration that even after everything she was still here and she wasn't done. The morning light poured through the windows of the small cafe across the street from Benny's Grill, casting long golden rays across Olivia's table, but she didn't notice. Her coffee sat untouched, the steam, long since faded its warmth, abandoned like a conversation that had cooled into silence. She wasn't there for breakfast, and she certainly wasn't there to think about food. She was watching, measuring time by the movement of people, the sway of the trees, and the moment that man would walk out the front door of his favorite booth like he hadn't done a damn thing wrong. Across the street, Rick Tolman sat with the same posture he always had, slouched slightly, legs wide, shoulders relaxed, like someone who had spent years mistaking arrogance for comfort. The waitress brought him his usual without being asked, and he grunted thanks without lifting his eyes. To the casual observer, it was just another Sunday, just another man finishing his meal before the day took him somewhere less predictable. But to Olivia, every second he spent acting like nothing had changed was another insult carved deeper into her memory. She waited until he pushed his plate aside, until his phone was back in his hand, and until his smirk returned, because it was always there, always curling at the corners like a shield or maybe a dare. Then she rose from her seat, walked calmly out the door, and crossed the street with the same steady pace that had carried her through deployments and courtrooms and operating rooms filled with pain. No one stopped her. No one called out. And when she pushed open the diner door, the bell overhead gave the softest ring, like even it had been waiting. Tolman looked up, and for half a second confusion registered just a flicker, but it disappeared, quickly swallowed by that same smug dismissal he gave Naomi on the street. Olivia didn't need a menu. She didn't need to sit. She didn't need to raise her voice. She just stood at the edge of the table and said, "Do you remember her name?" He blinked, leaned back slightly, then shrugged. "I don't know what this is." "She told you she was 10, Olivia interrupted, her voice low but unwavering. "She told you her name. She told you her father's name, and you laughed." Tolman's eyes flicked toward the waitress, then the manager behind the counter, and finally back to Olivia, trying to read whether he should deflect, deny, or just leave. But it didn't matter anymore. She reached into her coat pocket and placed her phone on the table between them. With one tap, the audio played. Naomi's voice filled the booth, shaky but brave. "I didn't do anything. Please let go." Then the the crack of a child's arm breaking under force that never should have been used. The diner went quiet. Chairs stopped scraping. Forks froze mid-air. Tolman didn't blink, but his jaw clenched a small tick, dancing near his temple. "You think you can walk in here," he started, but Olivia leaned in, cutting him off with calm precision. "You picked the wrong little girl," she said, "and you ran from what you did. You left her like she was nothing." For a moment he didn't speak, just looked at her like he wanted to say something that might make sense of it, but there was nothing to say. Nothing that could compete with the voice still echoing in the air. Olivia picked up her phone, slid a napkin across the table, and with it a note. Room 6, 10 years old, broken arm, audio sent to Internal Affairs. She stood straight, her voice quiet now, almost a whisper. "Your name is trending. Enjoy the rest of your breakfast." As she turned and walked out, the diner remained silent, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Tolman sat still, his appetite gone, his hands suddenly unsure of where to rest. Outside, Olivia inhaled deeply. The air was thick with late morning heat, the sky blinding blue without a single cloud in sight. Her phone buzzed as she reached the sidewalk. A message from Sergeant Sato. "Waitress just called it in," said a woman confronted Tolman. played audio, told him she knew everything. Olivia smiled, but it wasn't joy, it was something colder, something closer to relief. "I didn't touch him," she replied. "Didn't have to." By the time she returned to the hospital, the news had already broken wide. Reporters were circling. Social media feeds lit up like brushfire. Hashtags, multiplied number, justice for Naomi number, protect our children number, say her name. But Olivia didn't need the noise. She wasn't chasing attention. She was chasing truth, and now the world was listening. Back in Naomi's room, the child was awake, blinking slowly at the light as it slipped across the sheets. Olivia walked in her steps, softer now, more deliberate. Naomi turned her head, eyes still heavy, but they found Olivia's face with surprising clarity. "Did he see it?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Olivia nodded and sat beside her, brushing a loose strand of hair from her forehead. "He heard everything," she said gently. "And now, so has the rest of the world." Naomi didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her hand moved slightly, inching toward Olivia's, and rested there, not gripping, just touching. A small gesture, but it said enough. That she believed her again. That she didn't feel invisible anymore. That even though the pain hadn't gone, she no longer had to carry it by herself. Outside the window, the street was no longer still. People were gathering now, not shouting, not marching yet, but standing, watching, waiting. A few held signs. Some just held space. But all of them had come because a voice too often ignored had finally been heard, and no one could unhear it. And as Olivia sat in the dim hospital light, holding the hand of a girl whose arm had once been broken in silence, she knew that something had shifted for Naomi, for the people outside, and maybe, just maybe, for the world. They were all still trying to rebuild. The arrest didn't happen with flashing lights or dramatic takedowns. It came quietly, with the slow inevitability of truth catching up to someone who thought he could outrun it. By the time the two patrol units rolled down Tolman Street, the sky had just begun to pale with the first light of morning, that soft gray-blue tone that hovers between night and day, where everything feels fragile and exposed. Olivia was already there, parked across from his house, in the kind of silence that doesn't ask permission. Her hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, her eyes locked on the front porch, where nothing had moved for nearly an hour. She wasn't impatient, she was focused, the kind of focus that comes from days without sleep and years of watching systems fail the people they claim to protect. The neighborhood was still asleep, windows closed, lawns untouched by sprinklers, the stillness almost surreal. Olivia didn't glance at her phone, didn't need a signal to know it was time. She had already called it in Sergeant Sato, had confirmed the badge was flagged, the pay frozen, the paperwork in motion. All that remained now was the moment, the encounter, the reckoning. The sound of a garage door creaking open broke the hush like a crack in thin glass. Rick Tolman stepped out slowly, dressed in jeans and a zip-up hoodie, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He looked around with a jittery edge, like a man expecting ghosts but hoping for none. He moved with purpose but without confidence, heading toward a black sedan parked across the street. Olivia stepped out of her car just as he shut the trunk. He didn't see her until he turned around, and when he did, he froze. Not with fear, but with the exhausted recognition of someone who knows he no longer controls the ending. She didn't raise her voice, didn't reach for anything. She simply stood there, feet planted, arms relaxed, gaze steady. "I wouldn't leave just yet," she said, the words landing, not as a threat but as a sentence. Tolman's hand twitched toward his hip, but Olivia tilted her head slightly, not flinching, just watching. "Go ahead," she added. "That'll be the last move you ever make." For a second, neither of them moved. Then Tolman exhaled, sharp and bitter, and let his hand fall. "What do you want?" he spat, but the question didn't land. Olivia stepped forward. "I want you to feel something close to what you made her feel," she said. "Even if it's just for a moment." She didn't wait for a response. There wasn't one that mattered. With practiced speed and absolute control, she stepped into his space, caught him by the collar, and slammed him against the trunk of his own car. The impact echoed down the street, followed by the dull thud of breath leaving his lungs. "You grabbed a child," she said. "Slam! You broke her arm. Slam! You left her like trash. Slam!" He tried to push back, but she pivoted, twisted his arm behind him, and forced him down to one knee, her strength not angry, but deliberate, the way a surgeon might reset a bone. He gasped, the sound raspy and guttural, pain catching up to pride. "Hurts, doesn't it?" she murmured. Ever think about how scared she was? She made it up, he hissed between clenched teeth. "I didn't mean," but the sentence vanished beneath a sharp blow to his ribs that dropped him flat. Olivia crouched beside him, her breath calm, her hands steady. "You don't get to rewrite this," she said softly. From her coat pocket she pulled out a sealed envelope and pressed it against his chest. Inside were the documents that would follow him long after the bruises faded: a civil lawsuit for assault on a minor, a subpoena, a restraining order signed by Steven Seagal himself. "You're done, Rick," she said, "and if you come within 100 feet of her again next time, I won't stop at paperwork." The sound of sirens arrived next, not rushed, not dramatic, just inevitable. 2 squad cars rounded the corner, lights muted but spinning, and the silence that followed was heavier than their arrival. Neighbors had begun to step outside, some in robes, others holding phones, their expressions ranging from shocked to unsurprised. No one rushed to Tolman's defense. No one looked confused. This wasn't news to them. This was confirmation. As officers moved in and cuffed Tolman against the hood of his own car, Olivia stepped back, her hands now loose at her sides, her chest rising and falling with quiet precision. One of the younger officers glanced over, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "You're Olivia Keller?" he asked. She nodded. "My daughter's in art class with Naomi," he said quietly. "She still talks about the sketchbook." Olivia met his gaze, something soft but resolute flickering in her own. "She's not done drawing," she replied. "Not even close." And as they loaded Tolman into the back of the cruiser, the early light caught the edge of the sealed envelope on the pavement, now smudged with dust, but still clearly marked. One of the reporters who had arrived late snapped a photo, the image capturing Olivia standing tall in the morning glow, the cruiser door closing behind her, and the echo of justice finally touching ground. She didn't wave, she didn't gloat. She turned and walked toward her car, the noise behind her already building as sirens faded and headlines were drafted in real time. She slid into the driver's seat, closed the door, and rested her hands on the steering wheel, not gripping it tightly, just resting there for a moment. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows behind every object but lighting her face in full. And in that stillness, Olivia allowed herself one breath, just one that didn't carry the weight of what had been done but of what had finally been answered. The courtroom was packed long before the judge entered, each wooden bench filled with reporters, advocates, silent victims, and those who simply couldn't look away anymore. The air inside was thick, not with noise but with tension, thick like humidity before a thunderstorm, the kind that makes every breath feel heavier than it should. Even the lights above, steady and cold, seemed to hum louder than normal, casting a washed-out glow on the solemn faces, waiting to see if this time the system would listen. Olivia sat near the front, a worn leather notebook balanced on her knees, her fingers curled around the spine, not for notes, but for grounding. Her posture was calm, her face unreadable, but anyone watching closely could see it in her eyes, the careful containment of something that didn't want to be held back much longer. Beside her sat Steven Seagal, not the action star on posters or film sets, but a father cloaked in stillness, hands folded in front of him like he might snap steel if he let them move. He hadn't spoken since they entered the room. His gaze never drifted. And to his left, Naomi, 10 years old, dressed in soft blue, her healing arm resting in a brace across her lap, her eyes sharper than most adults in the room. She didn't fidget. She didn't smile. She sat still, quiet, steady, like someone who had already lived through a storm and knew the rain couldn't drown her twice. Across the aisle, Rick Tolman looked nothing like the man who once strutted through precinct halls with jokes on his tongue and entitlement in his walk. He looked smaller now, thinner skin, paler under the courtroom lights. He sat between 2 attorneys in dark suits, neither of whom made eye contact with him as the judge entered and called the room to order. He didn't look at Olivia. He didn't look at Naomi. And when the first piece of evidence was played, the emergency call Naomi had made, the courtroom didn't breathe. Naomi's voice spilled through the speakers, clear and trembling, the kind of voice that should have been protected, not punished. "I didn't do anything," she said. "Please stop." And then the crack. That unmistakable, sickening snap that cut through every defense, every doubt, every piece of manufactured justification. One juror flinched visibly. A woman in the back dabbed at her eyes. Even the judge's hand paused in mid-air before resuming its quiet shuffle of papers. Then came the photos, X-rays of the fracture, close-ups of Naomi's bruised wrist, images of her shoulder turned the wrong direction. The prosecutor walked the jury through it slowly, without theatrics, letting the evidence do what emotion never could, make it undeniable. Olivia watched each image not with shock but with the kind of quiet fury born from memory, from standing in hospital hallways holding the hand of a child who didn't understand why this had happened in the first place. She took the stand next. Her voice didn't waver. Her back didn't bend. She told the story from the moment Naomi pressed the emergency shortcut on her phone to the second Tolman was cuffed beside his own car. She didn't embellish. She didn't hold back. And when the defense objected to her characterization of Tolman's actions as deliberate, the judge overruled without blinking. "He didn't run because he panicked," Olivia said. "He ran because he thought he could." Witness after witness followed: nurses, EMTs, neighbors, even a retired lieutenant who admitted under oath that complaints about Tolman had been routinely buried to protect departmental reputation. The pattern was clear. This wasn't about one bad day or one poor decision. It was about a culture that had been told to look away until someone finally refused. And then Naomi was called. She walked slowly to the stand, her steps small but measured her brace, catching the light just enough to remind everyone that this wasn't theoretical, it was personal. The bailiff swore her in, and when she sat down, her feet didn't touch the floor. She didn't ask for water. She didn't ask for a break. She looked straight ahead and spoke clearly even when her voice softened. "He asked me for ID," she said. "But I'm 10. I told him my name. I told him who my dad was. He didn't believe me. Then he grabbed me and twisted my arm. I heard it break." She paused, and for a moment the silence stretched. Then she reached into her lap and unfolded a crayon, drawing she'd kept tucked beneath her sweater. A little girl standing tall in front of a crowd, her cast covered in stars. Below it were 5 words scrawled in blocky handwriting: "I'm stronger than he knew." No one clapped. No one moved. But every person in that room felt something crack, not like bone, but like the shell that sometimes forms around a conscience when it's seen too much and done too little. After 8 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for just over 6 hours. At 4:11 p.m. they returned. Guilty on all counts: aggravated assault on a minor, abuse of authority, obstruction of justice. Tolman didn't speak. He didn't cry. He didn't even look up as the bailiff cuffed him once more and led him away. Not in a squad car this time, but in chains. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown. Protesters, community leaders, parents holding their children's hands, strangers holding signs that read "Justice for Naomi" and "Protect Not Harm." Olivia stepped down the courthouse steps, first Stephen beside her, Naomi between them. Reporters called out questions, but no one stopped. There was nothing left to say, not today. And as they walked through the crowd, a breeze lifted Naomi's hair slightly, the sun catching in her eyes. She didn't wave. She didn't look overwhelmed. She simply walked forward, tall, silent, and unshaken, as if something inside her had finally settled. Not because justice had erased the pain, but because it had finally acknowledged it. The days that followed the verdict didn't feel like a celebration. They felt like exhale after holding your breath too long. It wasn't joy that lingered in Olivia's chest, nor was it victory. It was weight heavy, steady, the kind that doesn't leave just because someone says it's over. The courthouse had emptied, the crowd had dispersed, the reporters had packed up their cameras, but the echoes of what Naomi had endured clung to the city like dust in sunlight, visible only when you slowed down enough to notice. Olivia returned home that evening and stood at her kitchen sink, with her sleeves rolled up, the water running over a dish. She wasn't really washing, her eyes unfocused, her shoulders finally sagging in a way they hadn't for weeks. She didn't sleep much that night. The silence in her house wasn't comforting. It was too wide, too still. And when she closed her eyes, she didn't dream, she remembered. The hospital room, Naomi's small voice saying, "He laughed." The jury foreman's voice saying, "Guilty." The sound of handcuffs clicking shut. But what stayed with her more than any of it was the look on Naomi's face as they left the courthouse, quiet, composed, but carrying a tiredness that no 10-year-old should ever wear. By morning, Olivia was already at her desk again, sorting through emails, forwarding legal documents, responding to community leaders who wanted to know what came next. There was no blueprint for what they were building, no protocol for what justice looked like after trauma had been publicly acknowledged but never truly undone. Stephen joined her mid-morning, dropping a file onto the table without saying much, his eyes shadowed but alert. "We've got over 12,000 messages," he said, his voice low. "Stories, photos, people who've been waiting years for someone to listen." Olivia didn't ask who. She just nodded and opened the folder. The pages inside were messy, raw statements from parents, former officers, teachers, EMTs, and children now grown, all carrying the same wound dressed in different uniforms. Some were barely legible, handwritten in shaky ink, others typed in block capitals like the author had to shout to be heard through the screen. Olivia read them one by one, her fingers tracing under the lines, slowly, not skimming anything. These weren't complaints. These were confessions of a country that had looked away too long. By midday, she and Stephen sat side by side building what they called the record. Not just a database, but a reckoning. They weren't lawyers in the traditional sense. They weren't elected officials or celebrities playing at activism. They were something else now, a wall that others could lean against. "This is going to get ugly," Stephen said, scrolling through a spreadsheet of flagged cases. Olivia didn't look up. "It's already been ugly," she replied. "We're just not pretending anymore." That afternoon, they announced it formally, the launch of the Naomi Project, a coalition of civil rights attorneys, retired detectives, whistleblowers, trauma counselors, and digital forensic analysts, whose sole mission was to expose patterns of institutional abuse and protect the stories that had been erased. Within hours, their inbox flooded again. Local stations ran segments. National outlets picked it up overnight. The public wasn't just ready, they were desperate. But so was the system. 3 days later, Olivia stepped outside her home for her usual morning run and noticed something strange. A gray sedan parked too far from the curb, engine off, but warm windows tinted too dark for city code. She didn't pause, she didn't show it. But her next step was measured. Inside, she called Maria. "I think they're watching the house," she said. "Not reporters, not neighbors. Government plates." Maria didn't hesitate. "We've seen it before. They're testing boundaries. Keep your doors locked." By evening, online, whispers had started to spread, anonymous accounts accusing Olivia of manipulating Naomi, of staging the audio, of using the case to build a personal brand. None of it stuck, but that wasn't the point. The point was noise. The point was doubt. One post featured a grainy photo of Olivia speaking at a rally, with the caption, "Instigator or Advocate." Another showed a clipped screenshot of Stephen speaking to reporters. Is this justice or vengeance? Olivia didn't respond publicly. She didn't post a statement or hold a press conference. She just kept working because silence didn't scare her, not anymore. Not after hearing Naomi's scream on repeat and realizing it was the same scream she'd heard in different tones from too many families across the years. Fear wasn't new. It was familiar. But so was resilience. Later that night, she sat in the living room with the lights low, Naomi asleep upstairs, her breath soft, and even behind a cracked door. Olivia stared at the ceiling for a while before reaching for a yellow legal pad and scribbling 3 words across the top in dark ink. "We go national," not because they wanted to scale up, but because they had to. The problem wasn't local. It never had been. It lived in courtrooms, precincts, classrooms, and living rooms across the country. And now that people had started to speak, she had no intention of letting the silence return. Outside, a warm breeze shifted the wind chimes on her porch, the gentle clinking barely audible over the city noise. She closed her eyes, exhaled deeply, and let that sound settle her nerves. It wasn't peace. Not yet. But it was something close. Something earned, and as the clock ticked toward midnight, Olivia leaned back in her chair, pen still in hand, and whispered to herself, not as a vow, not as a threat, but as a truth that had waited long enough to be spoken aloud. "We are not going back." Silence. Stephen stood by the window of Olivia's kitchen, his arms crossed, his profile framed by late afternoon light that spilled in through thin linen curtains and pooled across the floor like a quiet memory. Outside, children played in the distance, their laughter faint and carefree, skipping across fences and sidewalks without a care, unaware of how close that innocence came to being extinguished in a single moment. He wasn't watching the street. He was watching the reflection of himself in the glass. Older now, heavier with time, with failure, with rage. He hadn't yet let himself feel. His breathing was deep and even, but his fists clenched at his sides betrayed the storm gathering in his chest. Behind him the room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old floorboards settling beneath their weight. Olivia sat at the table, one hand resting on an open file, the other cradling a mug she hadn't sipped from in nearly 20 minutes. She was reading, but not really absorbing her mind, caught between logistics and grief, between fury and fatigue. They had done everything they were supposed to do, gathered the evidence, held the press accountable, brought the case to court, but something about seeing the justice system finally move hadn't brought either of them peace. "I should have been here," Stephen said suddenly, his voice low but clear, each word delivered like it carried weight he could no longer hold alone. "You were where you had to be," Olivia replied, without looking up, not to console him but because she believed it. "You came when it mattered." Stephen turned slowly, leaning his hip against the counter, his jaw-tight eyes fixed on the table now. "It should have never come to that," he said. "My daughter had to say my name like a shield, and it still wasn't enough." His voice cracked at the edge of that sentence, not from weakness, but from the kind of heartbreak that only men who have trained all their lives to win every battle understand, the realization that there are fights no amount of strength can prevent. He walked over to the table, rested his hands on the back of the chair across from Olivia, and for a long moment didn't say anything else. The silence between them was heavy but unspoken, not uncomfortable but lived in like old armor that still bore the dents of old wars. Olivia finally looked up, eyes steady. "We can't change what happened," she said, "but we can decide what happens next." Stephen nodded slowly, lowering himself into the chair with the kind of weariness that didn't come from exhaustion but from restraint. "Then I want to speak," he said. "Not to the press, not to the cameras. I want to speak in that room. I want them to hear from her father." Olivia met his gaze, and for a moment, the weight of his name, his face, his legacy, all of it hung in the air. "It'll be recorded," she said. "It'll be replayed, picked apart." "You sure you're ready for that?" Stephen didn't hesitate. "They've already picked her apart," he said. "Now they can listen to me." 2 days later, Stephen took the stand. The courtroom was quieter than usual, not because people weren't present, but because the atmosphere shifted the moment he entered. He wore a dark suit, no tie, the sleeves slightly wrinkled from pacing in the hall beforehand, and when he sat, he didn't look to the jury or the crowd, he looked straight ahead. His hands stayed folded in his lap, his posture disciplined like a man who'd stood at the center of thousands of cameras and somehow managed to still feel unseen. "I'm not here as an actor," he began, voice deep and measured, carrying a stillness that drew every ear closer. "I'm here as a father. As a man who taught his daughter how to respect authority, how to speak clearly, how to keep calm under pressure, I taught her how to stay safe. I trained her. I gave her every tool I thought would protect her." He paused, breathing in through his nose before continuing. "And she still ended up with a broken arm on a public sidewalk while doing everything right." There was no outrage in his tone, no raised voice, no dramatic pause, just truth plain and bitter and undeniable. "She didn't resist," he said. "She didn't run. She didn't threaten. She spoke. She used her name. She used mine. And it didn't save her." He turned slightly then, just enough to look toward the defendant's table. "Because to you," he said, "she wasn't a child. She was a target. A problem. A moment you thought no one would notice." He leaned back slightly, his voice softer now. "But someone did notice. And now everyone sees you." The judge allowed the silence to settle before thanking him for his testimony. Stephen stepped down without another word, returning to his seat beside Olivia, his eyes forward, but his hand reaching for Naomi's as she sat beside them, listening without needing to hear every word. She knew, she had always known. And as the court recessed for the afternoon, the crowd didn't erupt. They didn't cheer. They didn't whisper. They stood quietly, respectfully, not in awe of celebrity, but in recognition of something deeper. A father standing not as a figure, but as a witness. Not for himself, for her. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a smoky gold, Stephen walked the edge of Olivia's backyard alone, hands in his pockets, the scent of cut grass and distant summer rain lingering in the air. He paused by the fence, watching the horizon, and for the first time in weeks let his shoulders fall. Not because the fight was over, but because he had finally been allowed to speak, not through fame or film, but as a man with nothing left to prove and everything left to protect. 3 weeks after the verdict, there was no celebration, no speeches, no confetti, no bright news segment to tie it all together. What remained was something quieter, deeper, the slow return to the ordinary shaped by the weight of everything that had been endured. Olivia found herself back in the community center's meeting room, the same place Naomi had once practiced piano, now converted into a temporary operations hub. Folding tables lined the walls, covered in laptops, stacks of files, voice recorders, and legal pads, marked with names and dates that felt like pieces of a much larger puzzle. There was no glamour in the work, no rush of adrenaline, just the steady thrum of people who had decided that silence was no longer an option. Stephen sat at one end of the room reading a typed affidavit from a woman in Ohio who had filed 4 separate complaints over 6 years, none of which had been investigated. His fingers moved slowly over the paper, pausing on phrases like "choked in front of my son" and called a liar by Internal Affairs. He didn't speak as he read, didn't shift his expression, but the quiet fury in his body was unmistakable, like a river dammed too long, and now learning how to move with purpose instead of destruction. Olivia, at the other end, was on a video call with a group of lawyers from Boston, their voices grainy through the laptop speaker but steady as they listed the cities that had already begun requesting access to the Naomi Project's database. What had started as a small strike against a single act of brutality was turning into something far larger, something institutional, structural, messy, and real. They weren't chasing a headline anymore, they were building a machine. One that didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for policy changes, didn't cater to politics. This wasn't reform, this was exposure. And exposure had consequences. That night, Olivia returned home and found a manila envelope taped to her front door. No address, no return label, just her name in thick black marker. She opened it slowly, carefully, gloves on her breath, steady, even as her chest tightened. Inside were photographs, grainy surveillance stills of her car, her walking Naomi to school, her sitting alone on her porch. No message, no signature, just a silent reminder that truth doesn't move without resistance. She didn't tell Naomi, not yet. The girl was healing well, finally eating full meals again, finally drawing again, her sketchbook filled with half-finished faces and buildings wrapped in vines. But Olivia knew what fear could do to a child. She had no intention of giving it more room than it already took. Instead, she scanned the images, cataloged the timestamps, then slid them into a folder marked pushback and placed it beside the growing pile of documents under her desk. Stephen, when she told him, didn't say much. He just nodded, exhaled slowly through his nose, and said, "Then we know we're close to something." And they were. Because with every new voice that joined them, every family who shared their story, every officer who came forward, every lawyer who took a risk, they were uncovering not isolated incidents but a pattern. One woven into policy and paper trails and phrases like non-lethal force and failure to comply. One designed to protect power, not people. By the end of the month, the Naomi Project had opened satellite offices in 4 other states. Volunteers staffed phone lines, transcribed handwritten letters, and chased down closed records that were never supposed to see daylight again. And still, Olivia didn't slow. Not even when the emails started getting more personal. Not even when her tires were slashed one night outside the courthouse. "We don't stop," she said one morning as she addressed the growing team gathered in the converted gymnasium. "We don't wait. We document. We reveal. And we protect the ones who have never been protected." She didn't need applause. What she needed was for everyone in that room to feel what she had felt when Naomi had whispered, "He didn't believe me." She needed them to remember it when the days got long and the backlash got louder. She needed them to feel it like breath, constant and unseen but essential. That evening, as the last of the volunteers packed up and the lights dimmed in the gym, Olivia stood alone near the exit, her coat folded over her arm, her phone buzzing in her pocket with messages she wouldn't check until morning. The space was quiet now, cleared of sound and movement, but it pulsed with something invisible, a kind of forward momentum born not of anger but of refusal. Refusal to let this be another moment that faded. Refusal to let Naomi's voice be one more scream folded into the background noise of the country. She walked outside, the air crisp, with the first sign of autumn leaves beginning to loosen their hold on the trees above. The street was quiet, the town was still, but she knew better than to mistake stillness for peace. She crossed the lot slowly, her footsteps echoing faintly in the cool air, and paused by her car looking up at the sky. The stars were dim behind the city glow, but one flickered near the horizon, just bright enough to catch her eye. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She just stood there for a moment, hands in her pockets, the night wrapping around her like armor she no longer needed to adjust. And in that moment, under that faint and flickering sky, she felt something settle, not resolve, not relief, but direction. A kind of knowing that once the world has heard a truth this sharp, it cannot go back to pretending it never happened. The gymnasium wasn't meant for moments like this. It had been built for community games, school dances, food drives, and folding tables, but on that particular night, the space held something different. Rows of metal chairs stretched across the hardwood floor, each one filled with someone who had chosen not to look away, not to move on, not to keep quiet. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting a pale yellow hue over the crowd where parents clutched photos of their children, teachers held worn folders of ignored reports, and veterans, nurses, and counselors all sat side by side, bound together by something that couldn't be named in just one word. It wasn't grief, though there was plenty of that. It wasn't anger, though that too had found its place. It was something deeper, a shared refusal. At the front of the room stood Olivia, her hands resting lightly on the podium as she scanned the faces before her, not as strangers, but as witnesses, each one holding a thread of truth that had too often unraveled in silence. Her voice, when it came, wasn't loud, but it filled the room in a way that made people stop shifting in their chairs and lean in a little closer. "We're not here tonight to fix what's broken," she said, "because the truth is, it's bigger than that. What we're building here isn't a repair. It's a record." A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd, not disagreement but understanding. She let it settle before continuing. "For every case you've heard, there are 20 more that never made it past the first desk. For every child we protect now, there are thousands who grew up thinking no one ever would. This is not about revenge, this is about reclamation. Of truth, of history, of each other." Stephen stood nearby, silent, but present, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes never drifting from the front row where Naomi sat beside a teacher who had once reported concerns and been ignored. Naomi looked smaller than she had on the courthouse steps, her shoulders pulled in slightly, her sketchbook resting in her lap, open to a page where a figure stood tall with words swirling around her like wind. "Say it anyway." The drawing wasn't angry, it wasn't messy. It was deliberate, clear lines, bold eyes, a girl who knew exactly where she stood even if the world still didn't know what to do with her. After the opening remarks, the microphone was passed around not to officials or speakers but to the people who had waited years for someone to hear them without interruption. A mother stood, voice cracking but unashamed, holding up her son's torn hoodie from a night 5 years ago when he never made it home from the park. A former officer admitted how many times he had written reports that disappeared into drawers, each one a confession that never made it to daylight. A teacher spoke of a girl who had bruises and perfect attendance, and how that combination had never made anyone ask the right questions. One by one, the voices layered over each other, not as noise but as harmony, each story strengthening the last, each memory lending weight to the next. Olivia sat down, letting them speak, letting the room become what it had always needed to be, not a courtroom, not a rally, not even a meeting, but a space that honored truth without demanding that it first be polished. When the last speaker stepped away from the mic, Naomi did something no one expected. She stood. Her brace was gone, now replaced with a smaller support she could take off during the day, and though her arm still moved stiffly, she held her sketchbook like a shield and a message at once. She walked to the front, not rushed, not pushed, and turned to face the room. For a moment she didn't speak. She just looked at them, all of them, her eyes meeting the faces one by one like she was memorizing the moment before it disappeared. Then she lifted the sketchbook and turned it outward. On the page was a drawing of a crowd, much like the one before her, and in the center stood a small girl with a megaphone, bigger than her face. Behind her, dozens of shadowy figures leaned in, not to silence her, but to listen. Above it, written in looping pencil, "If I say it, maybe they will too." Her voice, when it came, was quiet but carried like thread through fabric. "I didn't know what would happen when I pressed that button," she said. "I just knew I had to. Not because I thought someone would come, but because my aunt told me, speak, even if it's shaking. So I did." She paused, looking at Olivia, then back to the crowd. "And I'm still here, and I'm still speaking. Because now I know I'm not the only one." There were no tears, not in her eyes, not in her voice. Only a clarity that adults twice her age struggled to hold. She walked back to her seat, sat down, and reopened her sketchbook not to hide, but to keep creating. Because drawing for Naomi had never been about escaping the world. It had always been about explaining it. After the event, people lingered not to network or take pictures, but to talk quietly, to hold each other's hands, to promise things that weren't just words. A retired judge approached Olivia and offered sealed documents from a bench he no longer sat on. A journalist asked Naomi for permission to publish her sketch. A teenager whispered "thank you" and left a folded note under Steven's seat that simply read, "Because of you, I told my mom what happened." The gym slowly emptied. The lights dimmed one by one. But something had changed. Not just in the room, not just in the town, but in the way people understood their own stories. They weren't alone in them anymore. Later that night, as the wind picked up and leaves scattered across the parking lot outside, Olivia stood at the door, holding it open, as the last guest stepped into the night. Naomi stood beside her, hair pulled back, her coat slightly too big, her sketchbook tucked under one arm. She leaned her head lightly against Olivia's arm and asked, "Do you think this will help?" Olivia didn't answer right away. She looked out at the street, at the way the lamplight pooled on the pavement, the way the wind moved through the trees without asking permission. Then she looked down at Naomi and said, "I don't know if it will fix everything, but I know it made us visible. And that's where all real change begins." Naomi nodded once, as if that answer didn't need to be perfect, just honest. And as they stepped out into the cold together, the door clicked shut behind them, but nothing felt closed. It all felt like the beginning of something that might finally hold. There are moments in life when we're forced to choose: stay silent for the sake of safety or speak up for what's right. Naomi's story, a little girl only 10 years old, reminds us that sometimes a small voice can shake an entire system, but that voice only carries weight when it is heard, believed, and protected. For those who've lived long enough to witness the world change, the lesson isn't found in outrage but in unwavering resolve. Because justice doesn't arrive through noise, it comes through the quiet, steady persistence of ordinary people who choose not to look away. At any age, we can become guardians of truth by listening, by standing with the vulnerable, and by passing on to the next generation a simple belief that courage has no age, and that truth, once lit, will never go dark. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that truth and justice deserve to be heard, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story. Every subscription is a voice added to the movement, a spark of support for those fighting in silence. Let's build a community that doesn't turn away from injustice, a place where every voice, no matter how small, is heard,